You are listening to Sirva Soundbites, the official podcast of Sirva, a leading global relocation management and moving services company. Let's get started.
Hi, and welcome to Sirva Soundbites, where we aim to connect, inform, educate, and entertain our listeners. I'm Kate Rothwell, and I'm a Director of Account Management at Sirva. And today's special guest is Bill Kerr, who is a professor at Harvard Business School. We'll be talking about how global talent mobility can be a driving force for international growth. Bill, welcome to Sirva Soundbites. Would you like to introduce yourself for our listeners, please?
Well, thank you very much for having me, and it's a pleasure to join this podcast and be able to speak some about the important topics of global talent. As you mentioned, I'm a professor at Harvard Business School. I've also been for about 8 years now co-director of our Managing the Future of Work project, which is looking at a bunch of the topics related to the future of the workforce in a technology-heavy environment and with demographic pressures and where we want to go from there. Beyond that, for probably 25 years now, I have studied in various ways innovation and entrepreneurship, and particularly the lens of global talent and how it impacts those important dynamics in our work, in our economy, and our workforce.
That's an incredible story and background, and I think you're absolutely the right person to be talking to us about this topic today. So, Bill, apart from teaching, you've also authored several books, one of the most recent being The Gift of Global Talent: How Migration Shapes Business, Economy, and Society. I think this book really resonates with our podcast topic today, in particular, given that the global workforce is one of CEO's top three priorities
Yeah.
alongside growth and technology. What would you say about the global race for talent?
Well, I think it's an important race that, as you highlighted, companies are already feeling. And as we can kind of build up into, I think countries are feeling and will feel even more going forward. The book really, though, starts with some basics of let's try to put in place some numbers around the phenomenon of global talent. It's sometimes surprising for the first time when somebody recognizes that we know much more about the little widgets that we ship in cargo boats between countries
Yeah.
than we do about the knowledge workers that are flying in the airplanes that go from place to place, even though we're increasingly in a very knowledge-centric world. And so one of the starting points of the book is to let's build some statistics and some baseline for understanding the phenomenon.
Mhm.
And as like an early example, the further you go up in kind of the talent level, the more likely global migration is. So at the most basic level, about 2% of people that have a high school degree are moving out of their country of origin into another location. When you get to college educated workers, it's about 5%. When you get to inventors or you get to kind of people that are building new science, you get to 10 to 15%. When you get to Nobel Prize winners, you're at above 30%. And so there's kind of this level at which we are constantly having some of the most talented people move to opportunities and places to put that to work. And then that brings lots of implications in terms of how clusters form, how knowledge gets disseminated around the world, and how companies in particular can take a part of that process.
Hold on to that thought about inventors because we'll come on to those in a bit. But you mentioned about talent clusters, and that is one of the concepts that you cover in your book. And listeners will know about Silicon Valley, Hollywood, Bangalore, Manila, and ultimately how having those concentrations of talent in turn attract newcomers to the opportunities that are on offer there. There are some fantastic statistics, aren't there, Bill, about the number of patents that are produced by those talent clusters or within the talent clusters, aren't there?
Yeah, well, let me go back to just how familiar these are. I mean, we're focused on today's talent clusters, but economists going back to Alfred Marshall 100 years ago were already noting that industrial activity often concentrates in certain key locations. And that provides to the firms that are there a productivity advantage, and they're able to then be better at their work. And there's a number of theories and pieces of evidence as to how that sort of takes root. What's become ever different, though, is when we move from an industrialized economy into an economy that is more built around knowledge-based work, these clusters can, in turn, like further supercharge or be turbocharged in their nature. And a lot of that has to do, in the book, I kind of give this description of, as you think about the recipe of ingredients you need to be successful in the work that you're doing, to the extent that those ingredients just become simply talented people being in close proximity, you can pack a lot more people into one location compared to an environment where, you had to have a factory, you had to have a design team, you had to have a distribution network. There was a more balanced set of ingredients. And so to the kind of statistic that you highlighted, you can look at patents, in particular around software-related technology, and software is about half of patents that are being filed today globally. 6 talent clusters today account for about half of those patents that are being created. And that's a very significant kind of reconcentration of activity that through much of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and, inventive activity was being more spread out across the country in the United States. And today, those concentrations are happening. And it's also happening around the world in other environments as well, like the development of the Bangalores that you described. Mm-hmm. And so we have an environment where it's a very spiky innovation landscape. There's places that really, really matter towards being close to the frontier. And we can talk about how firms seek to participate or be a part of that landscape. But it's one that all of the dynamics of global talent and the knowledge-based economy are really accentuating. They're making even more important going forward.
Well, those talk of ingredients, you've got me thinking of cooking and baking. But if companies aren't physically present in those talent clusters, are there ways that they can take advantage of them?
I think for many companies, the question is, I'd reframe it as, how will you be physically present? Like, companies aren't required to stay exactly where they were originally located. And there's at least 3 broad strategies that companies take to be a part of talent clusters. One is, in a lot of cases, you see companies simply move their headquarters towards being in a place where they can more actively participate. This is particularly important if you are a company that's seeking to kind of be at the very frontier of technological advancement and knowledge development. And as we move into an environment where the pace of change, and the technology opportunities move so quickly, one of the consequences is your access or your ability to be close to where the new ideas are going to form can be even more important than what you've historically done in-house. So typical, we used to have a lot of heavy R&D teams, and companies kind of relied on this stock of knowledge that they had built up over, decades. And to the degree that the race is going to move very, very quickly, you being very close to where those new concepts and ideas are emerging can be super important. So you see some companies trying to allocate headquarters or an innovation team to one of these locations. There's a concept called an outpost or a satellite facility where you can participate in a talent cluster with a small team that's in a specialized environment. In the Boston area, I often point companies when they're visiting towards a place called CIC. It used to be the Cambridge Innovation Center, but now it's just known by its acronym CIC. And this is a remarkable building that has basically the equivalent of I think it's like the state of Pennsylvania in terms of the innovation activity and venture capital that's been done in one building. And it's full of startup companies and as larger companies, kind of satellite facilities in close proximity. And if there's one place that if I said you wanted to put 2 or 3 people and have them try to integrate themselves into the Kendall Square, Cambridge sort of technological community, that would be the starting point for doing it. So companies can be thoughtful about creating some of these environments. And that's a more long-term presence that they're having on the ground. The last one would be just immersions. A lot of leaders and a lot of corporate teams are taking more extended trips to the places that they need to learn more about. And that can be on like a 1-week basis in order to kind of get exposure to what are some of the leading thinkers working on in that space. And then you can kind of take that back home and ask, how do we apply that to ourselves? In other settings, companies have had even like rotating headquarters where they've moved the team for a while. Starwood's hotel chain was famous for doing this with some of the environments that they wanted to know better for for their work going forward. And so they would just take the whole team there for an extended period, maybe a month or 3 months, and be immersive there. And then that gave them an opportunity to learn on the ground what was happening.
Some great insights there, Bill, and certainly food for thought, I think, for some of the corporates that will be listening to our podcast. One of the things I was wondering is, since the pandemic, there's certainly been a greater move towards remote working. Some companies are starting to mandate return to office. Do you think that will have an impact on this talent cluster concept?
It's a great question, and one that I will, of course, want to recognize we don't fully know what the future could look like. And we
Of course.
made significant steps forward in terms of the digital connections across locations. That said, let me give a couple of arguments or reasons as to why, if anything, it may further reinforce the importance of consideration of talent clusters. Begin with the recognition of many of the ways that we actually use technologies, even if they would let us be scattered forever, to all corners of the globe, actually reinforce the value of place in a specific place. And so the thought experiment I often give is, who do I, send the most emails to? Like, or, what address does HBS, Harvard Business School, send the most emails to? And it's very clearly Harvard Business School. And I sit on the first floor of the Cumnock Center at Harvard Business School. And probably the number one destination of emails from the first floor of the Cumnock Center of Harvard Business School is, in fact, the first floor of the Cumnock Center of Harvard Business School. And we see this again and again. It happens with telephone calls, same kind of phenomenon. And Zoom, most of my Zoom and Teams meetings are with colleagues that I know through other environments, often whom have been that proximity. And so these technologies that can make the world kind of distance-free also have this particular feature. They often reinforce the value of us being in proximity at points in time to be able to work with us. So does it unbundle a little bit of the talent cluster where I'm more likely to be a part of it, but then I can be away for a month, or I can work from home 2 days a week? Yes, but it's also, most of the times we've seen this, it's reinforced. The best litmus test or the best yardstick for measuring this has been real estate prices. And in some cases, a few of the cities are still sort of struggling to rebound their real estate prices kind of from where they were before. But in some of the most important kind of talent hotspots, like the Kendall Square area around MIT, those prices tend to be extremely high and at high watermarks. So there's still a lot of value for this. Maybe a last point, just to kind of, again, appreciate the global nature of this kind of landscape, is we see these technologies as really also reinforcing the value of connection across the clusters. And maybe if I had gone back to Alfred Marshall's time, which was before the telephone was invented and other kinds of activities, the activity that was in that industrial cluster really was focused on what was happening in the industrial cluster. And even by the year 2000, when I became most closely connected to this phenomenon, at that point it was already commented upon as to how much the entrepreneurs and the engineers that were in Silicon Valley were connecting to counterparts that were in Taipei or in Seoul and other locations. And those technologies and the degree that we make communication and we also make transportation easier between those environments really strengthen not only the links across those communities, but also the importance of them to begin with. So it's kind of got this reinforcing effect on that value of the place there.
So the sense of place, the talent cluster will survive.
Yeah. An alternative, and this goes to the global talent framing. I'm not pushing readers too much towards trying to go find the book. But if you go find the book, there's a whole bunch of trends in there that we basically are able to really start measuring the role of global talent and the role of these clusters and so forth, starting around 1975. That's just a data feature that we have. And so I was born in 1974. It's roughly as old as me, so about 50 years at this point. And when you look at the trend lines, you see that they start and then they go up and they keep going up and they're going up and they're going up. And I often, reflect upon that a lot has happened in the last 50 years. So we have had, the development of the personal computer. We've had the internet. We've had the great financial crisis. We've had wars. We've had, like, life has thrown a lot at that curve, and the curve is unbroken. It just keeps on going up, and you don't even really see as many dips on there, which speaks to a more structural foundation piece that's driving this and what's behind it. Of course, it could be that and it will be at some point in time that's going to taper off. Whether it is 2025 and what happens over the next 5 years, we'll see. I would tend to, if I had to bet that the curves are going to continue to go up a bit further.
Okay. And we'll certainly look forward to seeing what the next 5 years holds.
Yeah.
But certainly no crystal balls around here. But let's widen the lens a little bit and take a look at immigration policies and how they support global talent mobility. Um, Regular listeners of the podcast will have heard recent Sirva Soundbites with our guest speaker, Ray Rackham, who is co-chair of Newland Chase, and he talks in depth about the impact of the H-1B policy on immigration. But for today, Bill, perhaps we can look more broadly at the different systems that are in place. I'm thinking employer-led versus country-led, and the way that organizations are able to mobilize their talent whilst keeping kind of within the structures of the immigration policy for that particular location.
Yeah. So at least at a conceptual framing, we often talk about like points-based systems versus employer-driven systems. And I'm going to, I think, try to articulate some of the pros and cons of each approach. But let me first recognize that no country sits exclusively in one domain or the other. Systems end up being hybrids of these two. The U.S. is more of an employer-driven system. Canada is more of a points-driven system. But they're going to have elements of each. So in a points-based structure, what you're doing as you screen applicants for the skilled or the economic visa slots, these get called different things in various countries, is you're trying to come up with some measure of, is Kate somebody that we want to have come into the country? And we may ask you something about like how educated you are. We can, your age is important to us. Do you have a lot of working life ahead or not? If you're going to Canada, do you speak French as well as also English? And this is where it also gets to be a little bit of a hybrid nature. Do you have a job offer from a Canadian firm? And so part of what you're doing from there is getting an assessment of, how you look in a candidate pool. And then at various sort of gates in that process, people with a more, greater number of points than some threshold kind of move on in the system and develop from there. Again, there is often a link to the employer side, but there's an assessment in general about the point structure. When you go to a more employer-driven system, so if you're looking at the H-1B visa program in the U.S., there's really only one core requirement, which is that a company wants to hire you. And in fact, if it's Bill Kerr now, if it's Bill that is seeking to migrate to the U.S., I can't apply for an H-1B. Somebody has to apply on my behalf. It has to be Microsoft or it has to be Procter & Gamble that applies on my behalf. And then there's some basic kind of like vetting about the level of this bachelor's degree has become more the norm here and so forth. And I have to be paid what's called a prevailing wage. But beyond that, like really the key thing is, does Microsoft want me? And then is there an available kind of visa for that year? And we can describe, and this probably came up in the earlier podcast, there's a lottery system that gets used because there's such demand in the U.S. So someone, you may ask, like, why an employer-driven system? Like, what are some of the potential advantages of that? And one of the key things is that there is a job that's associated with it. And these stories are sometimes apocryphal, sometimes there's reality to it. But everyone's heard this story of the taxi cab driver, that is a nuclear physicist that maxed out the point score, knew French and 14 other languages. But there really wasn't like a need for that in Canada at the time or whatever country the person was going towards. And so in this case, you have an employer saying, this is the person that we want. There's some more then subtle advantages to that, which is in a point structure, you could ask the question of, well, would a bachelor's degree in data science be more important to us now than a PhD in chemistry. That's a hard
Mhm.
kind of question to ask, and likewise, if we're just relying on that, we don't give any points for, is the person creative? Are they good at working in teams? Are they a complete jerk and we want nothing to do with them? But the employer, the Microsoft of this world, has the incentive to evaluate those pieces. So we're getting a lot of hidden and kind of soft and tacit information that comes from that process, which can be very good. Now, the analogy that I often use is I mentioned my age a little bit earlier. There's a very popular band called Poison that had a song, "Every Rose Has Its Thorn." And so you get thorns that come with the employer-driven system. It can be a very volatile system. So we don't have a particular set aside for the number of uses that we want to have towards engineering versus accounting versus some other field. And so it gets driven a lot by the demand. So it's both responsive, but it can also be a very volatile structure from that. It relies a bit, this is weakening over time, but it relies a bit on a particular tie between the employer and the worker because, again, to get Microsoft to invest all that, they would like to have some certainty that once Bill does arrive in the country, he's not immediately poached by somebody else, that was going to free ride on that work. And then there's also what we think of as just unintended uses. Like there's a number of times where visas can get used in ways that the policymaker and maybe some general version of the proverbial social planner that we might have would want to have towards use cases of visas, and yet you've given a firm the choice, to use it however they deem fit, within the guidelines and the broad regulations. And so that can lead this to settings where a lot of controversy right now sits around the use of visas for outsourcing related firms. So companies that are going to ultimately be facilitating the shifting of activity outside of the country. And do we want to have the precious, scarce visas being used for that when you know that somebody that is an AI scientist is being denied a visa at the same time because we don't have enough of them. And so the lottery system is a very crude way of allocating those visas across use cases.
Certainly a lot to unpack there, Bill. You and your family have got some experience of both of these types of immigration system, haven't you?
Yeah, well, my wife is an immigrant to the United States. She was born in Finland and did all of her kind of education and early work in Finland. She first came to the U.S. on a academic visitor exchange visa when we were dating and we were trying to convince her to stay, on this side of the Atlantic. She went through the H-1B visa process. In fact, per the typical story, the visas had run out that year, so she first went to Canada for, I believe it was about 9 months, while we waited for the next visa cycle to begin. And then she went ultimately through and became a permanent resident through a family-based visa, so via marrying me, and is today a U.S. citizen. And so I think part of my reason for unpacking all that story is it's always a complex weaving of the various visa policies under which any one person could be on. She had both an academic-oriented visa, the classic H-1B, ultimately was a family-based green card, and we see a lot of those kinds of twists and turns through the process. I think the thing I would highlight is we never found that process to be what I would say is user-friendly. It was never something that one felt like, oh my goodness, the official right now that's processing this really wants to make our lives wonderful and easy from this. But on the opposite side, and this is very important, one of my main concerns about where the U.S. is right now, and it's a kind of a warning for many countries, is it was a certain process. Like there was a lot of clarity as, okay, if you do this step and you get through this hurdle, on the other side, this really important thing is possible. It's going to be there. And what we find, time and time again is that if you want to think about the migration process and where in particular, talented people are choosing to invest in their schooling or where they want to invest in their early career and beyond, it's got a lot that is akin to making a big investment. Mm-hmm. And the one thing that we know really, really hurts investments, whether it's, picking someone to marry, whether it's opening up a chemicals plant, or whether it's buying a home. Like all these are investments. All of them, if there's uncertainty, you pause, you stop. You don't really know what to do next. And I think a challenge that we are facing in the United States is there's a lot of uncertainty about policy and policy changes that happen when a Democrat comes into office, when a Republican comes into office. There's a lot of movement around that. Yeah. And it's a challenge for the U.S., and it's also a challenge I think other countries are going to experience around this, that the more your system has some real clarity to it, some foundations, the more that's going to be attractive to the immigrants that you're seeking to bring in.
And certainly, from experience, attractive to the companies who are trying to mobilize their talent around the world. I'm not sure they're...
And if you're a policymaker too, I'd say that the biggest companies in the world always figure this stuff out. Like it's they have locations, and maybe we're going to talk some more about this. They have locations around the world that they participate in. They have the ability, again, like my wife's case, the firm that she was going to join had an office in Canada. So like she was able to go there and start with the company, and then some of the bigger challenges come for people that are in companies that are not as large and so don't have as much of a regular footprint in this domain. Oh. It's the same thing with the lottery. If, right now, there's such oversubscription for the H-1B that we just use a simple lottery system to allocate those visas outwards. And it's a system that if you're a very significant company, if you're a Microsoft, you put in a number of applications, that you're roughly going to get 1/3 of them, and you can kind of plan on that. And if you got an extra high yield that year, well, okay, we have places to put them to work. If you're a small, startup company operating out of that CIC that we described earlier, you can't just load the system up with a bunch of applications and, just play, well, we'll roughly get 1/3 of them right. Like you often tend to have much more discrete needs. You have to think more carefully about, well, what if we actually are trying to have, could we have 2 people come in this year, or do we need just one? And so those systems also disadvantage typically the smaller companies that are less regular in kind of the global talent process.
And perhaps have less of the infrastructure internally to manage that entire process.
Yeah. And as as the Sirva and others do, like the infrastructure is forming more broadly through companies that seek to aid in this environment, and can provide either the legal support or software to help visa processing. Or I'm on the board of a company that does nearshore talent provision. So there's a variety of ways that the ecosystem, because global talent is so important, the ecosystem is trying to form to help in this domain.
All right. So just one other topic to touch on, perhaps, Bill, and that is about return migration, a different facet of this global talent conundrum. Early in my career, I spent a good chunk of time working in Russia, and there were some opportunities for Russian nationals to take assignments overseas. At the end of their assignments, some wanted to stay in their new locations and localize there, but others were really intent on returning to Russia. And this obviously is going back of a similar vintage as you are, Bill. So the late 90s, early 2000s. But their return to Russia was kind of conditional on higher reward because of their unique experience. And I think you see similar trends in China, India, and I'm sure graduates from Harvard who are returning to their locations will face a similar kind of conundrum as well. What are your views on that?
Well, I think the world is becoming, to our earlier conversation, a much more integrated opportunity set. I mean, with unfortunate fracturing that's happening also geopolitically, but in terms of the capabilities that would exist for integrating careers across locations, it's made significant steps forward. When I was first working in this kind of space, this was actually in practice before I came back into academia, I spent a lot of time in one assignment flying between Seoul, Korea, and Silicon Valley, where there was a partnership that was about a wireless data technology coming to fruition. And there were some Korean scientists that were located in Silicon Valley that were really pushing this technology forward. And they were partnering with the SK group in Korea to make this happen. And at that time and at that environment, you tended to see less return migration. You had people that would go on expat assignments for defined shorter periods of time, say for 3 years to a country and back. But there was also, if I was to have looked at the stay rates for the foreign graduates of U.S. universities, or if I came to Harvard Business School in 2005, if I looked at the graduates of our MBA program at that time, there was almost always a presumption that you were going to stay in the United States or you're going to stay in London or some place like that. And there was less return migration to China or to India or to Africa and similar. And today, it's a different landscape. There's a lot more opportunity that exists abroad in those countries and in those environments. And in some cases, if you're an entrepreneur and you look abroad and you see how fast India is growing, you may want to lean into that's a great opportunity. Same with Vietnam. Like there's a lot of these things which are great. We want to kind of celebrate, but it also sort of heightens the ways that companies need to think carefully about these migration choices. And then also people are going to contemplate maybe different periods of time that they're going to spend in one location versus another location. And maybe it's more of a ping-ponging back and forth rather than a simple model where someone comes to the United States and they stay for forever, or someone comes to the United States and they return home once. There may be a much more constant flow between them. To your notion and experience, I do see that there remains sometimes gaps in expectations between what the individual is anticipating to be able to command salary-wise, or in terms of where they're going to start their career when they go back home and join the business that's in their home country, versus what is often available to them in those locations. And that leads to some mismanagement, or some people that are trying to think about, maybe I can't go home right now because I really need to, pay off the school debts, or I need to, it's better for me to wait another 10 years and establish myself in New York, and then I'm going to go home, because then it's not only that I've done my education abroad, but I've also, really developed a career experience that is going to be different and more valuable back in that home country. In general, it kind of also links to our remote work kind of conversation a little bit earlier. You're just going to have this, I think, an environment where we're going to have, whether it's how much you're in an office or how much you're remote, how much you are paid versus not paid, and the balances that exist across global companies. What's the type of job arrangement? There's going to be just, I think, less and less of a one-size-fits-all, and more of here's a bespoke set of attributes that sit with an opportunity, and how well does that align with the talented individual that you're trying to bring into your organization or attract. We haven't spend as much time today on kind of these pressures that are changing in terms of the demographic changes that countries, particularly advanced economies, are experiencing, the very, very fast pace of technological change. And when you're sort of trying to operate in that, where those things are kind of colliding or overlapping, and you're trying to think about that specialized kind of talent set, you're often going to try to think about, how do I appeal to Kate in particular? What is the thing that I need to activate her to be a part of my organization? And how can I bring her into my business in a variety of different ways to build from there?
So a lot more fluidity, a lot more personalization, I guess a lot more individual say in both their locations and the price that
Yeah.
they will
And
sign up for.
I think companies, and I think the companies that are listening to this need to be aware of the stakes that are involved. Like the access to talent. This goes all the way back to our very first conversation about the race that some companies feel. The access to talent is going to become ever more important in the future. And historically, when we saw multinationals opening up facilities, let's say for R&D, It was about, well, what we need to do is we need to be able to customize our products for the Japanese consumer or pass European emission standards. Or they were saying, I need to learn about this opportunity or what they're doing that's further advanced than what we're doing. Increasingly, you're also seeing it, though, it's about I need to access the talent to make my company super successful. And we're going to create a talent network around the world that is going to accomplish those. We know that in those settings, you face challenges, like you have to worry about access to resources. One of my colleagues, Raj Chowdhury, did a lot of great work about thinking about how the movement of talent within an organization really activates the resources that are provided to various parts of the team. You have to worry a lot about knowledge pools that form. One of the ambitions about being able to do these global centers is that you're going to be able to kind of harness the best of all those worlds. But if there's a pocket of knowledge that is sitting over in Dubai and is not being shared with what's going on in London, then you've lost a lot of the advantages or opportunities that sit there. And there's tactics and there's techniques to try to help there, but companies need to be aware that this is not, it's something that always looks great on paper, but it's like when you get down to the practice of like how you're going to pull it off, it's important. And kind of finally, I'd say is, as companies do it, they need to be respectful of, I want to say, like who they are. One of my more recent studies this was done inside the United States, but looking at different locations across the United States where companies were located. And you had, just say it starkly, like two different types of companies. One was a very decentralized company, meaning that most of the decision-making authority and the innovation was kind of broadly spread in the organization. And then you had a very centralized company. And as you know, a centralized company would have been like, hey, everything happens in this one building that sits, and it's the mega center of the corporation. And what you found when you looked at the facilities that these organizations were opening, these innovation facilities within the United States, so just other cities that were being created, the ones that were being opened up by centralized companies tended to look a lot more like headquarters than the companies that were being opened up by the decentralized organizations. So the decentralized ones, let's say they were opening up a facility in Silicon Valley, they tended to look ethnically and in terms of their talent base, just a lot like Silicon Valley. Mm. If you looked at the ones that were very centralized, they tended to have, almost equal weighting on what does the mothership look like compared to the satellite facility. And there are many ways that this was being reinforced. The movement of workers between the facilities was important for this. The collaboration across teams, so you'd have people at headquarters that were working on a patent with the people that were at the satellite facilities. All of these kind of practices ultimately reinforced those choices that were being made. And that's not to say that one necessarily must be good or bad, but companies really need to be thoughtful about how this is going to take root, because it really does then play out in terms of how tightly integrated is the activity that you're going to do at the new facility going to look like and be a part of what you've always done? Or is the whole point of doing this to activate something brand new and something very different for your business? And if that's the case, and if you're a very centralized business, you better be very careful as to how much you seed yourself into that new environment.
Well, Bill, you've given us so much to think about. But before I let you go, I'd like to ask you to share a top tip, please. What would you have for our listeners?
Well, I think my top tip when it comes to talent, and particularly global talent that we've described today, always goes back to I'll just pause and just have the listener think about in their mind, when I say global talent, who pops into your brain? And then I want to just make a couple of reflections. First, women are more likely to be part of the global talent today than men. There's more migration of women across borders than men. And second, the modal person is, while obviously the numbers that come out of China and out of India and so forth are big, the modal person tends to come from more of a mid-sized country, like the Philippines or Saudi Arabia or similar. And so what I often kind of say is my top tip is I personally conjure up a woman from Saudi Arabia as the person that if I want to think about how does a policy affect this? Or who is the, if a firm was to implement these kinds of practices, would they be practices that are useful and helpful in this setting? Trying to conjure up that more balanced and fuller perspective of global talent is really important for making the right decisions and choices.
Couldn't agree with you more, Bill. Thank you. It's such a pleasure to have you on our show. So once again, thank you to all of our listeners for listening to Server Soundbites. If you enjoy the show, please subscribe and share, and be sure to come back next time. If you've got questions or comments, feel free to drop us a note at soundbites@server.com. Until then, this is Kate and Bill. Don't forget, Server provides everything you need to move talent and deliver experience. See you next time.